Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Jon Myer Podcast. Now, today's topic is unlocking the full optimization of utilizing infrastructure and code efficiently. Now, joining me today is a returning guest, Asim. Thank you so much for joining me.
Always a pleasure to be here, John.
Okay, real quick, what is your role at CDW?
So I'm the CTO for emerging tech for CDW public sector.
All right, what does that really entail?
That entails becoming this connoisseur of emerging technology and ensuring that we separate the chaff from the wheat, and actually all the offerings that CDW presents to the customers. We have expertise, we have case studies, we have proven results, or at a minimum, because you can't have 20 years of expertise and everything bleeding edge, right? So at a minimum, we have the partnerships and we have a proven track record from those partners to ensure that they deliver result, even when it's not everything is necessarily ready this moment. So how do you that balance of progress and prudence? That's my job to ensure continues to get delivered from CDW.
So before we jump into our topic of actually utilizing infrastructure and code, not infrastructure as code efficiently, I do want to take a step back and talk about infrastructure as code. What is it?
So that's obviously been around for a decade and change, and we've seen many iterations of that. And so it's simply the concept that we do not treat infrastructure in any way, in any sacred way. It's simply resources that we can call based on our needs and through just our code, and utilize it, scale it, and frankly scale down and dispose when we're done with it. So we take away all ambiguity and all human interaction from infrastructure utilization, and it is purely driven by metrics. It's purely driven by code, and and we right size, scale, even move across geographic regions, etc., all based on what those contracts are in code, so to speak.
Is there a right way to deploy infrastructure as code efficiently, though?
Yes, and that right way depends on what your team is most comfortable with. First of all, what their native languages are, so to speak, not just in development, but what the culture is like, how the teams are formed today, what frameworks are prevalent, and what industries you serve, and what your patterns are for scaling up, scaling down, what your usage patterns are. Are you more consistent burn? Are you extreme growth and just growing to the sky? Or do you ebb and flow? So all of those then play into your infrastructure strategy. And how do you make all of that sing and dance? It's a matter of bringing all of those needs, the demands on you, the team strengths you have, and then picking the preferred CSP, tool set, integration partner, all of that. It's a intriguing and interesting and complicated dance to make happen. Because when you take your hands off of managing your infrastructure, obviously you can't play it by the ear anymore. You have to ensure that at least the known unknowns are accounted for as part of your planning and deployment.
Asim, I was going to ask you what are some of the challenges, but you've kind of went over those as not only some of the infrastructure as code and the value for a company is what is your use case, what is your language that everybody's speaking, are they doing, obviously Terraform or using something else to deploy it out, some Python. The other thing that I wanted to touch on is the skill sets, right? So skill sets into those specific language make it even more challenging to be efficient in deploying out the infrastructure and utilizing the code.
Yeah. So there are obviously scripting languages which line up neater to programming languages, certain ones, and then you want to capitalize on the team's strengths and their familiarity with that, right? If it should be XML or YAML that you express your parameters in, that kind of goes back. It's on one hand, it's 6 one way and half dozen the other. All is possible in all modern iterations of languages. So that's not it. You don't necessarily lose out. It's again a matter of friction reduction for your team, right? So if your heart's in Python and such, then obviously something like YAML works better for you, and you might enjoy. And if you want to stay cloud agnostic to a reasonable, and that's something worth touching on itself, is they can be too much of a good thing. But if you want to stay cloud agnostic, then of course Terraform is a very good friend. It should be a very good friend of yours, right? But then be mindful of the trade-offs you're making with that, right? Because all of those choices, they lock us into a level as well, and that is entirely reasonable, long as you've thought that through ahead of time.
When we're talking about like the infrastructure and the code, is there a different variation of code that is not taken into consideration when deploying out an application?
It comes down to how neatly your code is segregated, right? And if you've already been thinking, for example, serverless when you were developing code, well, why weren't you thinking that 20 years ago when you were developing your code? Like, the pattern didn't exist, but that's not an excuse, right? So unfortunately, it comes down to, again, it depends on what the vintage of the code is, how and what the prevailing best practices for developing code were at that time, how monolithic it is, and who wrote it, and how committed were they to code maintainability. And what is your strategy? What is today on, hey, we just want to maintain that? What's the life cycle of the application that you're expecting out of it, right? Because your investment of time and effort, well, that has to line up obviously to the criticality of the application and the expected life cycle. It's supposed to stick around and serve your business's needs. So no, one size, clearly it doesn't even, I'm not even going to say that one size doesn't fit all organizations. It's even within the code portfolio of an organization, one size does not fit from one application to the next. And you have to have a rather nuanced approach when you assess those. That can be expensive, and there are ways to mitigate that expense.
See, I'm going to actually do some clarification here, because we're talking about the infrastructure and infrastructure as code as one bucket. And then there's the business application code, correct?
Yep. Yes.
So when we talk about those, we want to optimize not only the infrastructure, whether it's doing it manually or through code, so infrastructure as code, or optimize the actual application code so that it is maybe not monolithic and is separated from services, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you separated those lanes for 1 second, because obviously they become one lane at the end, but traditionally they have not been one lane. And simply hoping for it to become one unified team and one lane, and it's better to recognize that that's not where things are for most of industry today. Now we can look back and say, hey, we've been evangelizing, all of us, for a decade plus, that this should all be one unified DevSecOps teams and all that. Well, people have expertise, people have their preferences, and you don't want to lose those people. And you also don't want to utilize your best resources, your best minds, in a suboptimal way. So instead of being dogmatic about it, how does one pragmatically approach and say some people's expertise and some people's leanings are more towards contributing quality code to from the business application angle, as opposed to some people's hearts are more on the infrastructure side, right? So as much as everybody is speaking in code, haha, um, it's a question of what do they want to write, right? Just like a writer, like some people are better at fiction and some are better at nonfiction. Like they could be equally skilled writers. And do you take a person whose heart is into journalistic writing and research and say, okay, write me a piece of fiction? Like, that's not what I do. So you want to be pragmatic about this, and again, not dogmatic, and then absolutely look at your needs on today, look at your needs on the business application code side, look at your needs and state of affairs on the infrastructure as code side, and then figure out what's the right time to start doing like this, like zipper merge between the two strategically, and how do you evolve either of them on their own depending on your needs today. I think that might be something to get into as well later, or how do you choose, but how do you do this zipper merge in a very neat fashion while keeping all of this in flight?
I like how you mentioned that they're separate lanes, but they all merge at the end. And if you think of those, the infrastructure is typically handled by your engineering, your support teams. They deploy it out. And then the business application, they're writing code to do it. But actually, at the end of the day, they're really writing the code to deploy the infrastructure to handle their application. When you have two separate entities, the business application and the infrastructure, when we talk about optimizing and utilizing them to the best thing, can you do both of them at the same time in parallel, or would you have to do one before the other?
So ideally, you would want to tackle both at the same time.
Doesn't that cause conflict between them though? Like if you're trying to do both and there's something goes wrong or something happens, is there ever a chance that you're overstepping each other?
Absolutely, and that requires that both teams, assuming at a minimum, because obviously security should be on the table, resilience should be at the table, business, but at a minimum, these two technical teams, which are running these streams on their own. And by the way, I know many folks are listening and cringing and saying, oh, we will live in this site reliability SRE world and everything is written, and like all infrastructure and all code is written by like one person or a team, and they deploy it and they're fully responsible for it and such. I'm just going to say, yes, if you're a startup, obviously, and please don't change a thing. But enterprises, even smaller ones, they don't live in that world. They're a hodgepodge of, a COTS code that they've bought. They're a hodgepodge of old applications and new applications, open source, what have you. All of that exists. And to look them in the eye and say, how one person or a small team of site reliability engineers are like writing everything and a DevSecOps manner, deploying it, and they're fully responsible for resolution. Yeah, no, it doesn't work that way, because they sometimes have often in public sector especially, the staff behind all of these grand initiatives and efforts is tiny. And you can only expect them to be proficient at so many things. So the more control you have, usually the more expertise and depth you need in that. And then that's possible if you're a startup and you're dealing with one standardized framework. The moment you're like, hey, I got like 2.5 decades worth of legacy in here, and I got dozens of languages that I'm dealing with, and God knows how many versions and how many OSs and iterations, all of a sudden this ivory tower view of, hey, everything should be written top to bottom by the team inside and be maintained by a small group of minds, so to speak, well, that falls apart. It's just not realistic. And so looking at that reality, yes, you're still going to have people, if they're on a separate team or not, it doesn't matter. right? You're still going to have people focused on business code, and you're still going to have people who are focused on the infrastructure side of things. As you said, maybe manual today. Yes, we still have that a whole lot today. And we as an industry can't leave them behind saying good luck and goodbye, right? We got to bring them along because there are reasons they're sticking to what they're sticking to. Maybe that's the firepower they have. So how do we reach out, make it easy for them to adopt the patterns and the efficiencies that many of us have discovered a long time ago, as opposed to saying, oh yeah, you just don't belong, right? So to them, it's a matter of looking at these teams, or forget the teams, but the goals of business code and the goals of infrastructure, right? And looking at the goals and saying, where are we today individually for a second? And where would we like to be in 6 months, in 36 months, and so on and so forth individually? And then looking at, and I recommend explicitly stating out loud, we are here to serve the businesses' needs. We are here to serve our users' needs, because that allows you to step away from, oh, I belong to this team or this is my expertise, and say, what am I here to actually do? I'm here to utilize my skills to serve the business's need. Now you're free to reach out to your colleagues who are more focused on the adjacent area, who you don't necessarily think of as sharing your problems with, but now you do. So now you have clarity on what you're here for, and you have a plan ahead of, okay, my team, we want this done in the next several months. And with the objective aligned and with your plans of evolution in front of each other, you now can start doing that neat zipper merge of who does what at what stage, to not just not disrupt, but actually empower what the other team is looking to do. Because you could reorder things in your plans. You could eliminate duplication from your plans, right? And get more output for the organization and towards your end goal through your now coordinated efforts.
Awesome. You mentioned a couple of things of talking about it, not only from a business perspective. Now, this is only from sitting inside the company, right? And empowering them within the company to do these and to tackle some of these challenges. But how are you at CDW empowering these customers, enabling them to tackle not only the infrastructure, but the code as a separate entities, but also to zipper merge them?
So the best thing about CDW is that we have about the widest catalog of offerings in the world. And sometimes that can be less than a best thing about CDW, because we have about the widest catalog of offerings in the world. So the point to start is, I think a very prudent way to start is going through a simple assessment, right? And this is not bits and bytes. This is about us having a conversation and a short engagement with the customer who's not quite sure what's the most optimal way to start. Like where is the most bang for the buck, to use a overused phrase, for them right now. So we can engage, assess their needs, assess their current state. Not only on the code side, we have automated tooling available to actually assess code and infrastructure. And so this can be a fairly short and efficient engagement on where you are, what your business goals are, what's the state of your code in a quantifiable way, and in an automated and fast way. And then what's the state of your infrastructure, again, in an automated and quantified way. Out of that comes a list of recommendations from us and colleagues much smarter than myself, who've been doing it for decades. And we then have a consolidated plan saying, all right, we propose in conjunction with the customer that you proceed in this order, and you actually do the zipper merge in this particular fashion, where you iterate some parts of your infrastructure, you bring your business code, to another iteration, and then we continue to move both of these side by side, engage security, engage resilience, compliance, what have you. Everybody starts coming into the fold more and more, and we encourage folks to write less policies. Yes, write policies, but less of them, and express their opinion more in code, because then end of day, we want a pipeline one way or another, right? And maybe we start with stubs for it, for people to contribute to in the beginning, and there's nothing getting committed today. But as teams come online and develop those capabilities, and again, that's a game of evangelizing and enabling that we play, right? To keep bringing teams which previously were like, well, this is not what I do. Well, no, come on, let's do this. And it's not difficult, and it is adjusting to specifying your opinion in a codified way. So there is no flex, but then there is also no ambiguity, right? The best opinion from the team members who could advise you in writing on a certain thing, well, when they express it in code, well, their best opinion is available to you unfiltered, without any mediation, so to speak, right? And you get to, as an organization, you get to benefit from it the most in a concentrated way.
Asim, can you talk to me a little bit more about what type of tools, or what tools you're utilizing to enable them to actually utilize the infrastructure and code more efficiently?
Yeah. I'm so glad you asked. Because for infrastructure optimizations and moves and such, we have our own tool. We've developed it internally, called SkyMap, and that is a result of us learning over a decade plus of migrations and moves, to say it's not technical tooling that slows people down, because technical tooling, there's smart engineers all over the world, and it's very gratifying to solve a technical problem and say, I made it 1.3% more efficient. There's a lot of gratification in that. So guess what? A lot of effort gets put on that side of thing, on technical tooling, looking at bits and bytes. And we have an embarrassment of riches on that side often. What we discovered was far too many migrations and moves were getting delayed, not because of lack of bits and byte tooling, or tooling generally that focuses on the machines, right? That wasn't a problem. The problem was the tooling to organize processes and humans, teams, that either didn't exist or it was far too amorphous. So then you had to make sense of that tooling. It existed, you needed to make sense of it. And when you're dealing with like large migrations and such, time is absolutely of the essence. But even I would argue that even above time is morale. You got to be able to show clarity with every step that you take. Enhance clarity. And if you don't, you start losing morale. And if you sit around and configure your team coordination tooling or your process tooling over the next, God knows, 6-12 weeks, you've lost that time. Well, how about a tool which is purpose designed for these large migrations, that has a proven prescribed process which is flexible, but you're never starting from a blank page. It has clarity on who does what stages exist, what are the quality gates, all of those are prescribed in there. And again, they're modifiable, but you have very strong recommendations based on our decade of experience baked in there already. On top, the fact we're standing behind it, because just as I was saying, it's one thing to write an essay on a matter, right? You need perhaps a deeper level of clarity than simply talking it out, because now you're expressing your opinion in writing. It takes another level of clarity, another level of expertise, and frankly, confidence to now codify and say, this is exactly what we believe should be the starting point. And I insist, starting point. It's a very strong, complete starting point, full plan that you can execute on as is. It's also modifiable. So SkyMap is in the business of organizing human teams and processes and ensuring there is clarity from day one, and there is extreme visibility. Nobody can hide from it in terms of what the progress of the project is, how much time is left, how much work is left to do, where the bottlenecks are for the teams, so we can send help, swarm, and resolve those bottlenecks, ensure that the project keeps moving smoothly. So it's rock and roll from a minute one. Full migration or move processes, all prescribed, clarified in terms of what throughput you can expect for what type of team commit. Because again, people who have day jobs, if you simply give them another job, that's not going to get done. So what's the commit from them that we have available? And then what do we as partners need to bring to the table to make it all happen within, again, the budget and the time and the technical limitations and so on and so forth. So as opposed to guessing, we have all codified our expertise in there, and that leads not just the customers' teams, but we live by, we dog food this, right? We live by it ourselves. It's a value add. We don't sell it. There's no charge for it. It's part of our engagements that, when we start with the customer, we bring in SkyMap, and then it leaves no trace at the end. There's no licensing. So it's the perfect tool to keep everybody accountable and keep our efforts quantified.
Asim, at the end, you actually brought a little more clarity on what SkyMap is. I was actually going to ask, is this a process, is an automation tool, an installation, an agent, something that needs to be installed? Does it provide you a prescriptive plan of actions on what to do and actually follows it throughout it? Help me understand a little bit more on the value of a customer like me utilizing SkyMap.
I'm glad you asked. So there are no agents to install. It is completely SaaS. Runs in the cloud, and it operates purely on import-export basis. We intentionally designed it that way. So because the moment you have agents and you actually have to install them, that's
a friction right there.
Exactly.
That's a stopping point for a number of customers. They're like, nope, can't do. Sorry, that will take you 6 months.
There you go. So we, from the very beginning, decided that it is very much going to be a puppet master. So the tooling that the customer, for example, has already approved for their CMDB, for their internal discovery, for what have you, security scans and such, we can import information from those sources to SkyMap, right? And then we can export information from SkyMap back to those as necessary. So we are very, very flexible. If it can spit out a CSV, we can use it. As simple as that. We intentionally did not want any agents in, from SkyMap. So and obviously, when it comes time for risk and security to look at things, we can ensure that they look at the data that's being exported from their systems. They can bless what they allow us to, what they would allow us to take. And at times, customers will obfuscate a field or two and say, no, can't take this. No problem. Dealt with those patterns. We know how to work around those. So we'll leave those and put representative hashes in there and move data into SkyMap. And then there you go. Now you have one pane of glass to look at your progress. And it is running on real, continually updated data, which is authorized to leave your organization. And there's nothing, and it's basically anonymized to the point that you want. You then have clarity from your teams on who's doing what. SkyMap will do follow-ups for that. So John, I'm sure you've never had to text somebody and say, "You owed me this. Where is that? You want your end?"
No, not
No, that hasn't happened
I'll
to you,
leave
right?
my real world example for another time. So you were talking about obviously SkyMap is handling the infrastructure, utilizing a different tool to handle the code side of it.
Yeah, so we are lucky at CDW because there are folks out there who compete with SkyMap, right? And then but SkyMap also, if you're a likable, good person, then you end up developing a friend cluster of likable, good people. And SkyMap has had a good life, and it's a likable tool. So guess what? It has friends which are just like it with complementary skills. So as much as there are folks out there who have products that compete with SkyMap, it becomes much harder to compete with the joint value that we present through our portfolio, of tools there. Next, the one you're touching on, the need you're touching on is for code analysis, is addressed by another proprietary tool that CDW has. It's called SAMA, and that is in the business of looking at your SVNs, your GitHubs, and what have you. And there are like 40-ish code bases at this point, for that 40-ish like languages, frameworks that it can assess today. And it takes away the drudge, that whole frustration and the cost of having your code analyzed by a human. Because again, people who are actually at that level or in their professional progress that they can comment on their people's code and those comments to be of value, well, those are few and far between, and their time costs a lot. So how do you ensure that you get a good sense of how optimal your code is? Are there any security concerns? And where might updates be needed to take the code into a serverless environment, and so on and so forth? How do you get a picture of all of these obvious questions in a rapid, actionable way without costing you a ton? So SAMA does that. SAMA will look at your code repo and will parse out the inefficiencies in the code and the vulnerabilities and the opportunities for updates, and produce a result based on each code base and say, well, here is where I'm seeing smoke, right? And then you can send a human to see in a directed fashion, as opposed to scanning Yosemite end to end. You're like, well, that's where the smokes are, there's smoke there and there's smoke there. Humans can go and look at those and say where any fire of concern is, as opposed to let's just keep scanning this with humans because it's possible, slow and expensive. So SAMA takes the need away for manual code analysis to start. It's an excellent starting point. It's a wonderful complementary value add to SkyMap, where we have the infrastructure picture and automation on one side. We have the code analysis, automated code analysis on the other side. And then as part of that, as I was saying, assessment, somebody not an organization not knowing what's the most optimal point to start. Well, an assessment is because we can come in, look at the facts on the ground and present a path saying, here's where your value is to maybe start with SAMA in the beginning because, hey, you got an audit coming in X number of months and we need you to be ready for that. Seems like your infrastructure, as much as it may not be optimized, but at least it's in a good state of health, right? So let's figure that out. Today, your efforts should go towards code analysis, and then we shortly, after that, we'll bring your infrastructure efforts more towards modernization as well.
When you're talking about doing some and optimizing the code, and then it can look at your infrastructure, it's more of a suggestion that you can actually do these in parallel without overstepping each other.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you give us the freedom, or if you give any, forget who's doing it, forget if it's human or tool oriented, the fact that you're saying, hey, I'm not going to bind you to any requirements from the other side. Like you do the best you can. Assume that you can have the changes you want made in the infrastructure. Assume you can just ask for them and they'll happen. I'm not giving you any requirements from their side. And same for infrastructure, saying, code, I'm not telling you what to do. You do your thing. You tell me what you need. Just tell me what you need to do your best, right? You untie people's hands and then you say, being able to do it in parallel, right? You untie people's hands and say, we'll come up with the best plan for both sides and a best plan, then morph it into a best plan together. And that's what we will do. Because otherwise, the moment you say this one side is staying static for the moment and this other side can move forward, well, the expectations and the capabilities from the side that's saying, whichever side is saying static, well, those are fixed capabilities and expectations. The other side, when it moves, has to still keep catering to those, as opposed to saying, well, I'm ready to let these requirements go. And it's like, I've been only holding on to those because you needed them. I'm happy to let them go too. And like, why are we running this? Forget this. Let's move to the next like phase of evolution, right? So in an ideal world, having wide analysis, right? A holistic analysis, and then choosing the path forward in a unified way is the smartest thing. That usually we usually don't live in an ideal world, and same applies to these problems as well. We usually have to choose which to move forward with. And again, the tooling is built in a way where it can operate in sync, or one can lead the other. And then we can strategically, reduce the distance as goals are accomplished.
Asim, you talked about doing these in a zipper approach and then a parallel approach. So handling not only your infrastructure using SkyMap and then your code using Samba. Is there a balanced approach between both methods?
Yes. And that is where we won't, I guess, for this go deep into FinOps, but that's where it kind of comes into play.
We could do a whole segment
exactly
on FinOps. But in fact, we will run out of time if we started that now.
Yeah. But just to borrow from that approach a little, right? Just wade into that just a little and we'll come right back out, is the balanced approach would be to look at what the opportunities for the organization are to serve the citizenry, serve the customers, right? And look at the loftiest of those goals and then work backwards from there and say, all right, given again the goals that the organization has, what can we make happen with our existing skill set, with our existing budget allowed, and so on and so forth. And then where do we see most impact, right? Is if downtime is concerned, maybe we look more towards automating infrastructure and moving it right to a more resilient location in the cloud, perhaps. Because you're not complaining about anything else, you're happy with everything else, just that stuff is just gets overwhelmed, or you lose connectivity for whatever reason, and your facilities aren't quite resilient enough. They're not keeping up. Okay, fine. Well, let's address that problem, as opposed to, hey, we've just invested in our infrastructure a couple of years ago. We still have some time to amortize that, but we're not quite sure how secure is our code, and we are an agency or an organization which is, public trust is everything to us. So what do we do? It's like, all right, well, let's look at your code, because the traditional view of security is defend from outside in. Well, and I think a lot of organizations are very good at it because it's a known pattern. We've been doing it for a couple of decades, at least, if not more. We evangelize to run a parallel effort of securing from inside out, right? From code out, and then meet in the middle, because flipping that perspective exposes vulnerabilities and removes Duplication removes suboptimal processes which just didn't need to be there. But how do you do that in an efficient way? So that's what we always are trying to balance. And we have practices internally where we want to make it very simple and inexpensive for our customers to start thinking about inside out as opposed to outside in security. And I know zero trust is a cool way to say that, but we actually encourage to go deeper than that, because even zero trust doesn't necessarily think all the way to like the center of the value add and then spreading out from there.
Awesome. I got to wrap things up, and we've been talking about SkyMap and Sama. And if I want to learn more information about it, I'm very intrigued by it. Where can one go?
So it's cdw.com, and then there is a page for cloud solutions, and from there you can click on SkyMap and you can click on Sama, and you can see the specifications that they have and some case studies, value add, etc. The best thing, frankly, is to email cloud@cdw.com, because please be as specific about your needs as you can be. And we have some very passionate ambassadors, customer ambassadors inside CDW who monitor those channels, and we'll find you the right team.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me again on this podcast.
My pleasure, John. My pleasure.
All right, everybody, this has been the Jon Myer Podcast. And today's topic was unlocking the full optimization of utilizing infrastructure and code efficiently. Don't forget to hit that like, subscribe, and notify, because guess what? We're out of here.